Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what you never knew you had. For 69-year-old Levi Boone, the savage storm that destroyed his modest Texas ranch in 1876 was supposed to be the very end of everything. With nothing left but splinters and mud, he was ready to walk away. But his stubborn donkey Mercy had other plans. Digging through the wreckage, she unearthed a rusted iron box buried deep beneath the floorboards. Inside were letters from a woman he'd loved and left 30 years ago. The letters told of a child, his child, now grown, living nearby under a name he didn't know. Could this old cowboy with nothing but regrets find the family he never knew existed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun climbed slow over what remained of Levi Boone's life. He stood at the edge of the destruction, boots sunk deep in mud that had once been his front yard, and tried to make sense of the twisted lumber and scattered belongings that littered the Texas prairie, like the aftermath of some terrible battle. The storm had come through in the dead of night, a wall of wind and lightning that sounded like the very heavens were being torn apart. He'd huddled in the root cellar with Mercy braying her protest beside him, listening to 30 years of work being ripped from the earth board by board. Now, in the pale morning light, the full measure of his loss stood before him. The ranch house, modest as it had been, was gone entirely. Only the stone chimney remained upright, a lone sentinel marking where warmth and shelter had once been. The barn had collapsed inward on itself, crushing the last of his winter hay. The fencing that had taken him years to build and maintain lay in tangled heaps, useless as broken promises. Levi was 69 years old, though his back felt closer to 100 this morning. His hair had gone white years ago, and his face carried the deep lines that come from decades under the Texas sun. He'd built this place from nothing, bought the land with money he'd saved working cattle drives in his younger days, back when his knees didn't ache with every step. Back when the future seemed long enough to matter, Mercy stood beside him, the old donkey's grey coat still damp from the rain. She was 14 now, which made her something of a miracle in these parts. Most working animals didn't last half that long, but Mercy had always been stubborn, ornery, and entirely too smart for her own good. She'd been his only constant companion these past 7 years, ever since the last of his ranch hands had moved on to better prospects. He reached down and scratched behind her long ears. "Well, girl," he said, his voice rough from too little sleep and too much grief. "Reckon that's the end of it." Mercy turned her head and fixed him with one large brown eye, as if to say she had opinions about his surrender. She'd always had opinions. The nearest town was Redemption, a hard day's ride south. Levi figured he could make it there in a day and a half on foot, maybe sell what little he could salvage and find work sweeping floors or mucking stables. Dignity was a luxury for younger men. At his age, work was work, and he'd be grateful for any of it. He walked through the ruins slowly, salvaging what he could. A dented cooking pot, his shotgun, miraculously undamaged where it had fallen near the cellar door. A few tools scattered across the property. He found his worn leather journal wedged under a piece of roofing timber, its pages swollen with rainwater, but still intact. He'd kept it for years, though his entries were sparse. Notes about the weather, the condition of his meager herd, the things that needed fixing. Reading back through it was like watching his life reduced to maintenance and survival, one terse sentence at a time. The journal was bound in cracked leather, its spine reinforced with twine he'd replaced more than once. Inside, his handwriting grew shakier with each passing year. March 1870, lost 2 head to mountain lions. Need better fencing. September 1872, first frost came early. High stores adequate. January 1875, Mercy turned 12. Still sound. It wasn't poetry, but it was honest. A record of a man who'd chosen solitude and hard work over just about everything else life had to offer. He slipped the journal into his coat pocket, one of the few things worth keeping. As he picked through the wreckage of what had been his home, memories drifted up like smoke. He'd come to this land in 1846, a young man of 39, with a past he'd been trying to outrun. He'd worked the cattle trails, saved every dollar he could, and bought this patch of prairie for a price that had seemed impossible at the time. Building the house had taken him 2 full summers, working alone mostly, occasionally hiring help from passing drifters when he could afford it. The work had been good for him. It had given him purpose, a reason to wake up each morning. The solitude had been welcome too, after everything that had come before. There were parts of his past that Levi didn't care to examine too closely. Choices he'd made that still sat heavy on his conscience, even after all these years. He'd loved a woman once. That was the part that hurt most, when he let himself think about it. Her name had been Caroline, and she'd worked in a saloon in Abilene. Not one of the girls upstairs, she'd been clear about that, but a singer, a woman with a voice that could make even the hardest men go quiet and listen. She'd had auburn hair that caught the lamplight, and eyes that saw right through whatever walls a man tried to put up. They'd had something real, he and Caroline. Or at least he'd thought it was real. For 6 months in 1846, Levi Boone had allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life. A life with a woman beside him, maybe children, maybe something that looked like the families he'd seen in passing, and never quite understood how to want for himself. But fear had won out in the end. Fear and the restlessness that had always lived in his bones. One morning he'd simply left, told himself it was for the best, that a saloon singer and a man with his kind of past had no business building a future together. He'd never looked back, never sent word. Just disappeared like morning fog. That was 30 years ago. He'd thought about her over the years, of course. Wondered where life had taken her. Hoped she'd found someone better. Someone who didn't carry the weight he carried. But he'd never reached out. What would be the point? Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. Mercy brayed suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. She'd wandered over to what had been the foundation of the house, where the floorboards had been torn up and scattered. The donkey was pawing at the mud, her hooves making soft sucking sounds as she dug. "Leave it be, girl," Levi called. "Ain't nothing there worth," but Mercy was insistent, digging harder now, throwing mud behind her in determined clumps. Levi sighed and walked over, figuring he'd have to pull her away before she worked herself into a state. Mercy could be single-minded when she got an idea in her head. As he approached, he saw what had caught her attention. There, in the mud, where the floorboards had been, something metallic glinted in the morning sun. He knelt down, his knees protesting, and brushed away the wet earth. It was a box. An old iron box, about the size of a bread loaf, its surface covered in rust and sealed with a simple latch. The metal was cold and rough under his fingers as he worked it free from the ground. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been for its size. Levi sat back on his heels, holding the box in both hands. He'd lived in this house for 30 years and never known this was here. Must have been buried by whoever owned the land before him, or maybe even before that. The box looked old, the kind of old that spoke of secrets deliberately hidden. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked the latch. It was stubborn, corroded by decades underground, but finally it gave way with a reluctant crack. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly kept the moisture out, was a bundle of letters. They were yellowed with age, tied together with a faded blue ribbon that might have been pretty once. Beneath them, a small leather pouch that jingled softly when he lifted it. Coins from the weight of it, but it was the letters that held his attention. He lifted the bundle out carefully, untied the ribbon with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, but hurried. And the name at the bottom stopped his heart. Caroline. He read the first few lines, then had to stop. His hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. He looked up at the sky, blinking hard against the sudden burning in his eyes. "Mercy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What have you found?" The donkey just looked at him with her usual patient expression, as if to say she'd been trying to tell him all along. Levi forced himself to read more carefully now, taking in each word. The letter was dated September 1846, just 3 months after he'd left Abilene. Caroline's words were careful, measured, but he could feel the emotion underneath them like heat from a banked fire. She was pregnant. Had been when he left, though she hadn't known it yet. She'd tried to find him, sent letters to every town she thought he might have gone to. But Levi Boone had been running hard in those days, and he'd covered his trail well. The baby had been born in March of 1847, a son. She'd named him Thomas. Levi read through letter after letter, watching his son grow up in Caroline's careful words. First steps, first words. The boy's curiosity about who his father was, why he'd left. Caroline never spoke ill of him in the letters. She was too kind for that. But he could feel the weight of his absence in every line. The later letters spoke of choices she'd had to make. She'd left Abilene, moved to a small town to give Thomas a better chance at a normal life. She'd married eventually, a good man named Robert Hayes, who'd given Thomas his name and treated him as his own. Caroline had written that she was grateful, that Hayes was kind, that her son would have a father, even if it wasn't his real one. The last letter was dated 1861. Thomas was 14 then, growing into a fine young man, according to Caroline. They were living in a town called Silver Creek, about 40 miles from where Levi sat now. She'd written that she didn't expect Levi would ever read these letters, but she'd kept writing them anyway. A record, she said, so that someday, if Thomas ever asked, she could show him that his father had been real, that there had been love there once. Even if it hadn't lasted, she'd hidden this box here, she explained in that final letter, because they'd passed through this area on their way to Silver Creek. The property had been abandoned then, and she'd buried the box under the floorboards of the empty house, leaving it as a message to a ghost. If Levi ever came back this way, if he ever settled in this particular piece of nowhere, maybe he'd find it. And if he didn't, well, the earth could keep her secrets. Levi sat in the mud for a long time, the letters spread across his lap. The sun climbed higher, warming the damp earth, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders. He had a son who was 29 years old now, a grown man who'd lived his entire life not knowing his real father. A son who might have children of his own by now, making Levi a grandfather without ever knowing it. The ranch was gone, and that much was clear. But sitting here in the ruins of one life, Levi realized he'd been given an unexpected chance at another. The letters mentioned Silver Creek, 40 miles. Close enough to reach, if a man had the will to try. He looked at Mercy, who'd settled down in the mud beside him, chewing contentedly on a tuft of grass that had survived the storm. "What do you think, girl?" he asked. "One more journey for a couple of old fools?" Mercy's ears twitched forward, and Levi took that as agreement enough. He gathered the letters carefully, wrapped them back in the oilcloth, and tucked them inside his coat next to his journal. The coins from the pouch, $67 in old currency, went into his pocket. Enough for supplies, maybe. Enough to make the trip. He pulled himself to his feet, every joint complaining, and looked south toward where Silver Creek would be. 40 miles. He'd walked farther in his younger days, but that had been a different man in a different body. Still, some things were worth the pain. He whistled for Mercy, gathered up his shotgun and the few salvaged supplies he could carry, and turned his back on the ruins of his ranch. The morning stretched out before him, full of uncertainty and the ghost of old regrets. But for the first time in 30 years, Levi Boone had something more than survival driving him forward. He had a destination, and maybe, if he was very lucky, a chance at redemption he didn't deserve, but would try for anyway. The first few miles passed in a kind of daze. Levi walked south with Mercy plodding alongside him, the weight of his pack pulling at his shoulders, and the weight of Caroline's letters pulling at something deeper. The landscape rolled out before them in gentle waves of prairie grass, still heavy with yesterday's rain. Wildflowers dotted the fields, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, their colors bright against the brown earth. He'd walked this country for decades, knew every rise and hollow, every creek bed and stand of mesquite. But today, it all looked different somehow, foreign, as if the storm hadn't just torn up his ranch, but had rearranged the very world he'd been living in. Around midday, He stopped by a creek to let Mercy drink and to rest his legs. The water ran clear over smooth stones, making a sound that should have been peaceful. He pulled out the letters again, couldn't help himself. Reading them was like pressing on a bruise, painful but impossible to stop. One letter in particular kept drawing him back. Caroline had written it in 1853, when Thomas was 6 years old. She described how the boy had asked about his real father for the first time, wanting to know why he'd left, if it was because of something Thomas had done wrong. Caroline had written about holding her son while he cried, about the careful lies she'd told to protect a child's heart from a truth too complicated for him to understand. Levi folded the letter with hands that shook. He'd done that. He'd put those tears in a 6-year-old boy's eyes without even knowing the child existed. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. A small silver locket fell out from between two of the letters as he was putting them away. He caught it before it hit the ground, surprised he hadn't noticed it before. The chain was delicate, tarnished black with age. He opened the locket carefully. Inside was a miniature portrait, the kind that cost real money to have made. A woman's face looked out at him, Caroline, though older than he remembered her. Her auburn hair was pulled back, and there was a tiredness around her eyes that hadn't been there in Abilene. But her expression was gentle, kind. The face of someone who'd learned to carry disappointment with grace. On the other side of the locket was a lock of dark hair, fine and carefully tied with thread. Thomas's hair, he realized. Caroline had saved a piece of their son and kept it close to her heart. The locket was the kind of thing a woman gave to someone she loved, a token meant to be carried and treasured. Caroline must have put it in the box, hoping that someday he'd find it and understand what he'd lost. What he'd thrown away. Levi closed the locket and held it tight in his fist. The metal was warm from his palm, a small, solid weight that felt heavier than it should. He slipped the chain over his head, tucking the locket under his shirt, where it rested cold against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said to the empty air, to the ghost of a woman he'd loved badly. "I'm so sorry, Caroline." Mercy nudged his shoulder with her nose, a gentle reminder that the world was still turning, that sitting by a creek wouldn't change what needed doing. He pulled himself up, every muscle protesting, and kept walking. By late afternoon they came across the first signs of other people. A small homestead sat in a shallow valley, smoke rising from its chimney. Levi considered stopping, maybe asking if they knew anything about Silver Creek or about a family named Hayes. But something held him back. This felt too private, too raw. He wasn't ready yet to put his shame into words for strangers, so he kept to the edge of the property, giving the homestead a wide berth. A dog barked as they passed, and a woman came out onto the porch, shading her eyes to watch them. She raised a hand in greeting, and Levi returned it, but he didn't stop. The sun was sliding toward the horizon when doubt finally caught up with him. He'd been walking for hours, his mind churning through the letters, through Caroline's words, through the magnitude of what he was attempting. And now, with his legs aching and his back screaming, a simple question rose up and wouldn't be ignored. What made him think he had any right to do this? He stopped walking, the question pinning him in place. Mercy continued on a few steps before realizing he wasn't following, then turned to look at him with patient confusion. Thomas was 29 years old. He had a life, a name that wasn't Boone, maybe a family of his own. He'd grown up without a father, yes, but Caroline had written that Robert Hayes had been good to him, had raised him as his own. What right did Levi have to appear now, decades late, dragging his regrets and excuses behind him like chains? The boy, no, the man now, had every reason to hate him, to slam the door in his face, to tell him exactly what he thought of a father who'd run away before his son was even born. Levi wouldn't blame him for that. Wouldn't blame him for anything. Maybe the kindest thing would be to turn around, to leave Thomas Hayes to his life, unburdened by the knowledge of who his real father was. Some truths didn't need to be spoken. Some wounds were better left alone. He looked back the way they'd come. The destroyed ranch was miles behind them now, lost beyond the horizon. There was nothing back there for him. But forward, Forward held a confrontation that might break whatever was left of his heart. The locket felt heavy against his chest. He pulled it out, opened it again to look at Caroline's face. She'd kept his secrets all these years, had protected their son from the truth of his father's cowardice. But she'd also saved these letters, had buried them where he might find them. That meant something, didn't it? She could have burned them, could have let the past stay buried and forgotten. But instead, she'd preserved every word, every detail of their son's life. She'd left a trail for him to follow, a door opened just a crack. Maybe she'd wanted him to know. Maybe despite everything, she'd hoped he'd come looking. Or maybe he was just an old man, trying to find meaning in coincidence, seeing intention where there was only happenstance. A vulture circled overhead, riding the evening thermals. Levi watched it for a moment, thinking about how some creatures thrived on death, on the remains of things that had fallen. Was that what he was doing? Picking through the bones of an old love, looking for something to sustain him. Mercy walked back to him and stood close, her warmth solid and real. He put his hand on her neck, felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing. The donkey didn't know anything about regret or shame. She just knew forward from backward, and she'd already decided which direction they were going. "All right," he said quietly. "All right." They walked until the light failed completely, then made camp in a stand of cottonwoods near a shallow stream. Levi had no bedroll anymore, lost to the storm, so he gathered dry grass and made a nest of it, covered himself with his coat. It wasn't comfortable, but comfort was a luxury he'd long since stopped expecting. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Crickets and frogs, the whisper of wind through the grass, Mercy's occasional snort as she dozed, standing up. Above him, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, so many he couldn't have counted them all if he'd tried. Somewhere under these same stars, Thomas Hayes was living his life. Working, sleeping, maybe lying awake thinking about whatever troubles a man of 29 might carry. He didn't know his real father was coming. Didn't know that an old cowboy with nothing left to lose had decided to walk 40 miles on the slim hope of finding something that might be called family. Levi closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to the letters, to Caroline's words, to the child who'd grown up asking questions that had no good answers. He thought about all the years he'd spent alone on that ranch, building fences and fixing roofs and telling himself it was enough. That solitude was what he deserved, what he'd chosen. But lying here in the dark, wrapped in his coat on the bare ground, Levi Boone finally admitted a truth he'd been running from for 30 years. He'd been lonely, bone-deep, soul-crushing lonely. And the ranch, the work, the careful routine of his days, all of it had been nothing but a way to avoid facing that emptiness. The storm had destroyed his shelter. Caroline's letters had destroyed his excuses. There was nothing left now but the truth. Bare and unadorned, he had a son, and he was going to find him. Morning came cold and gray, with clouds threatening rain again. Levi's back had stiffened during the night, and it took him several minutes just to sit up, working the knots out of his muscles, one at a time. Getting old was a series of small humiliations, each day bringing some new reminder that the body was just borrowed time. Mercy was grazing nearby, unconcerned with philosophy or regret. Levi envied her that simplicity. They set out early, Levi chewing on the last of some hardtack he'd salvaged from the ranch. His supplies were thin. He'd grabbed what he could in the confusion after the storm, but it wasn't much. Maybe enough for 3 more days if he stretched it. After that, he'd need to find work or beg, and neither prospect sat well with him. The landscape changed as they walked, becoming more rolling and wooded. They passed through areas where mesquite gave way to oak, where the grass grew thicker and greener. Signs of settlement became more frequent. Fences, cattle in the distance, the occasional plume of chimney smoke marking another homestead. Around mid-morning, they came across a small trading post at a crossroads. It was a weathered building with a sagging porch, but the sign out front proclaimed it as Morrison's General Supply. A few horses were tied up outside, and Levi could hear voices from within. He hesitated. The letters were still tucked inside his coat. Caroline's words burning against his ribs like hot coals. Part of him wanted to keep walking, to maintain the private nature of his journey. But he needed information. Silver Creek was out here somewhere, and he'd save himself time and trouble if he could get proper directions. He tied Mercy to the porch rail and pushed through the door. Inside, the trading post was dim and cluttered, shelves packed with everything from canned goods to tools to bolts of fabric. 3 men stood at the counter, locals by the look of them, sharing stories with the proprietor, a heavy-set man with a beard that reached his chest. The conversation stopped when Levi entered. 4 sets of eyes turned to assess him, taking in his muddy boots, his worn clothes, the pack on his back that marked him as a traveler. "Help you?" the proprietor asked. His tone was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Need directions," Levi said. "Looking for a town called Silver Creek." One of the men at the counter, younger than the others, spat tobacco juice into a can at his feet. "Silver Creek's about 25 miles southwest of here. You got business there?" "Personal business," Levi said, keeping his voice even. The younger man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Personal business. That's what my wife calls it when I'm late coming home from the saloon." The others laughed, and Levi felt his jaw tighten. But he forced himself to relax. These were just men passing time, not meaning any real offense. At his age, he'd learned that most conflicts could be avoided if you didn't take every slight as a challenge. "Southwest, you said?" Levi asked. The proprietor nodded. "Follow the main trail out of here. You'll cross Copper Creek after about 10 miles. Can't miss it, there's a bridge. From there, just keep southwest. You'll see Silver Creek sitting in a valley. Can't be more than a day-and-a-half walk. Maybe 2 at your pace." "No offense, none taken," Levi said. He turned to leave, then paused. "You happen to know a family named Hayes in Silver Creek?" "Robert Hayes?" The proprietor scratched his beard, thinking. "Hayes, don't know that I do, but I don't get down that way often. Silver Creek's got maybe 300 people. You asking around when you get there, you'll find who you're looking for." Levi nodded his thanks and left. As he untied Mercy and started walking again, he heard laughter from inside the trading post, and he knew they were talking about him. The old man with personal business. Probably thought he was chasing some woman or running from debts. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was more complicated than they'd believe anyway. The trail southwest was better maintained than the path he'd been following, rutted by wagon wheels and marked with the occasional signpost. Other travelers passed them going the other direction, a family in a wagon, a pair of riders who nodded but didn't stop. Normal people going about normal lives, unaware that they were passing a man carrying 30 years of guilt like stones in his pockets. By afternoon, his feet were blistering inside his boots. He'd walked too far too fast, pushing through pain he should have respected. But something drove him forward, an urgency he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was fear that if he slowed down, if he gave himself too much time to think, he'd lose his nerve entirely. They reached Copper Creek just as the sun was starting its descent. The bridge was solid, well built, spanning water that ran swift and clear. Levi stopped in the middle of it, looking down at the current. Fish moved in the shallows, dark shapes against the lighter stones of the creek bed. He pulled out the letters again, couldn't help himself. Reading them had become a compulsion, something he did whenever he stopped moving, as if Caroline's words could somehow prepare him for what was coming, could give him the right things to say when he finally stood face to face with his son. One letter, dated 1856, caught his attention. Thomas was 9 then, and Caroline wrote about how the boy had started asking about his future. What kind of man would he become? Would he be like his real father, whoever that was? Caroline had written that Thomas had his father's hands, large, capable, meant for hard work. She'd noticed it watching him help Hayes in the workshop, the way he gripped tools with natural confidence. Levi looked at his own hands, weathered and scarred from decades of ranch work. The knuckles were swollen with arthritis now, the fingers not as steady as they'd once been, but they were still strong enough, still useful. Inside the same letter, Caroline had tucked a piece of paper, a drawing that Thomas had made. It was crude, the work of a child, but it showed a house and 2 figures. One tall, one small, father and son, Levi realized. The boy drawing a wish, a life that existed only in his imagination. Levi traced the child's pencil lines with his finger, careful not to smudge them. This drawing was nearly 20 years old, preserved by a mother who'd understood its importance. A boy's dream of having his father home. The drawing became the artifact he carried in his shirt pocket, separate from the other letters. It was small enough to fit there, and whenever doubt crept in, which was often, he'd touch it through the fabric, reminding himself why he was doing this. Not for himself, not for redemption he didn't deserve, but because somewhere, a long time ago, a 9-year-old boy had drawn a picture of a father coming home. He folded the drawing carefully and tucked it away, then continued across the bridge. Mercy's hooves made a hollow sound on the wooden planks, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Southwest. 25 miles, maybe less now. Every step was taking him closer to a meeting that terrified him more than any storm ever could. But he'd made his choice. The ranch was gone. Caroline was likely gone too, based on the dates of her letters. All that remained was Thomas Hayes, a man who didn't know his real father was coming, and Levi Boone, an old cowboy who'd spent 30 years running, had finally decided to stop. That night, Levi made camp in a grove of live oaks, their branches spreading wide to create a natural shelter. The clouds that had threatened rain all day finally made good on their promise, but the canopy above kept most of the water off him. He sat with his back against a trunk, listening to rain patter on the leaves overhead, and tried to imagine what he'd say when he finally found Thomas. The words wouldn't come. Every opening felt wrong. Too casual, too formal, too full of excuses. How did you begin a conversation with a son you'd never known? What tone did you strike? What right did you have to expect anything at all? Mercy stood nearby, her grey coat darkening in the rain. She'd found shelter of her own, standing in the lee of a large oak where the ground stayed mostly dry. The donkey's presence was a comfort, as it had been for years. At least one living thing in the world didn't judge him for his failures. He pulled out his journal, the leather still damp from the storm, but the pages dry enough to write on. By the dim light of a small fire he'd managed to coax into life, he tried to put his thoughts into words. May 17th, 1876, he wrote, his handwriting shaky in the firelight. Have walked maybe 15 miles since the storm. Found letters from Caroline. Have a son named Thomas Hayes. He's 29 now, living in Silver Creek. Don't know what I'm going to say to him. Don't know if I have any right to say anything. He stared at the words for a long moment, then added, scared. Haven't been this scared since the war. The war. He hadn't thought about those years in a long time, had trained himself not to. But sitting here in the dark with rain falling and doubt eating at his resolve, the memories came back whether he wanted them or not. He'd been young then, barely 23 when the fighting started. Had joined up with other Texas volunteers, thinking it would be a grand adventure, a chance to prove himself. Instead, he'd learned what it meant to watch friends die, to go days without food, to live with fear as a constant companion. The things he'd seen, the things he'd done, they'd changed him in ways he was still discovering decades later. When the war ended, he'd been adrift. The man who'd gone off to fight no longer existed, and the man who'd come back didn't know how to fit into the world anymore. That's when he'd found himself in Abilene, working odd jobs and trying to drink away the nightmares. That's when he'd met Caroline. She'd been the first good thing in his life after years of darkness. Her voice, her kindness, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth saving, it had all felt like too much. He hadn't known how to accept it, how to believe he deserved it. So he'd done what felt safest. He'd run, and in running he'd created the very thing he'd been trying to avoid. More regret, more guilt, another weight to carry. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the rain-heavy air. Levi closed the journal and tucked it back in his coat. Writing the words down didn't make them any clearer, but at least they were recorded. Maybe someday, if Thomas ever wanted to know who his father really was, this journal would tell him. Not the polished version, not the excuses, just the truth of a man who'd spent his life running from himself. Morning brought clearer skies and the familiar ache in Levi's joints. He forced himself up, packed his meager supplies, and continued southwest. The trail was muddy from the night's rain, making the walking harder, but he pushed on. Around midday, they came across an old man sitting beside the trail, his back against a mile marker. He looked to be in his 70s, rail-thin and weathered like driftwood. A crutch lay beside him, and his right leg was wrapped in dirty bandages. The man raised a hand in greeting as Levi approached. "Afternoon, friend." Levi stopped, studying him. "You hurt?" "Twisted my ankle 2 days back. Been making slow progress towards Silver Creek. Was hoping to make it by tonight, but I don't think these old bones are going to cooperate." Silver Creek. The coincidence made Levi pause. "That's where I'm headed." "Need help?" The old man's eyes lit up with gratitude. "If you could spare a hand, I'd be obliged. Name's Joshua Brennan. Folks call me Josh, Levi Boone." He helped Josh to his feet, foot really, and let the man lean on him. Josh was light, almost frail, but he had a grip that spoke of old strength. They walked slowly, Josh hobbling along with his crutch on one side and Levi supporting him on the other. Mercy trailed behind, patient as always. "You got people in Silver Creek?" Josh asked after they'd covered a quarter mile. "Maybe," Levi said. "Looking for someone. I know most everyone in town. Been living there 30 years. "Who you after?" Levi hesitated, then figured there was no harm in asking. "Family named Hayes, Robert Hayes and his wife Caroline." Josh's expression shifted, something sad crossing his features. "Robert Hayes passed 5 years back." Heart gave out. "Good man, though. Real good man." Levi felt the news settle in his chest. He'd never known Robert Hayes, but the man had raised Levi's son when Levi hadn't been there to do it himself. That deserved respect, deserved gratitude. "What about Caroline?" he asked, though part of him was afraid of the answer. "Caroline Hayes died last spring." "Same thing, her heart." "They said it was peaceful, at least. She and Robert are buried in the church cemetery." The world tilted slightly. Levi kept walking, kept supporting Josh's weight, but inside something was crumbling. Caroline was gone. The woman whose letters he'd been carrying, whose words had driven him forward. She'd been dead for a year now. He'd never get to apologize, never get to thank her for keeping their son safe, never get to explain why he'd run. "You all right?" Josh asked, peering at him with concern. "Fine," Levi managed. "Just knew them a long time ago. Lot of good memories in Silver Creek for the Hayes family," Josh said. "Caroline was beloved, always helping folks, singing at church. And their son Thomas, he's done well for himself. Opened a carpentry shop in town. Makes beautiful furniture. Robert taught him the trade, Thomas. His son was a carpenter, working with wood and tools, creating things that lasted." The thought made something warm unfold in Levi's chest, fighting against the cold news of Caroline's death. "Thomas ever marry?" Levi asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "He did about 5 years back. Nice woman named Martha. They've got 2 children now. Little Mary's 4 and James just turned 2. Grandchildren." Levi had grandchildren. The revelation hit him with unexpected force. Not only had he missed his son's entire life, but he'd missed the beginning of another generation. Children who carried his blood, his legacy, without ever knowing his name. They walked in silence for a while, Josh grateful for the support, and Levi lost in thought. The old man in his arms was a stranger, but his words had reshaped everything. Caroline was gone. Robert Hayes was gone, but Thomas was there, alive with a family of his own. From his pocket, Levi pulled out a photograph he'd found in the bottom of the iron box, a photograph he'd been saving, afraid to look at too closely. It showed a young man, maybe 25, standing beside Caroline. The photograph was damaged, faded with age, but the faces were still clear. Thomas had Levi's build, his broad shoulders, his strong jaw. But he had Caroline's eyes, her gentle expression. He stood with one hand on his mother's shoulder, the pose of a protective son. A good son. Levi tucked the photograph away carefully. His son was real. Not just words and letters anymore, but a man with a life, a family, a purpose. A man who'd grown up without his real father and had become someone worth knowing anyway. Silver Creek was close now. Another day, maybe less. And then Levi would have to face the moment he'd been both seeking and dreading, standing before his son and trying to explain the inexplicable. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek. The town sat in a valley just as the proprietor at Morrison's had described, surrounded by gentle hills covered in oak and mesquite. From their vantage point on the trail, Levi could see the main street stretching through the center, lined with buildings that looked sturdy and well-maintained. Church steeple rose at one end, and he could make out what looked like a schoolhouse on the far side. 300 people, the proprietor had said. Small enough that everyone knew everyone, large enough to support shops and trades. The kind of town where a good carpenter could make a decent living, where children could grow up with space to run and neighbors who looked after each other. Josh pointed toward a house on the near edge of town. "That's where I'm staying with my daughter." "If you could help me that far, I'd be grateful." Levi helped him the rest of the way, Mercy trailing behind. Josh's daughter, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and capable hands, came out to meet them. She thanked Levi profusely, tried to press money into his hand for his trouble. He refused it, but accepted her offer of a meal and a place to rest before continuing into town. The house was warm and clean, filled with the smell of bread baking and stew simmering on the stove. Josh's daughter, her name was Ellen, set a bowl in front of Levi and wouldn't hear his protests about taking her food. Her husband, a quiet man named Samuel, tended to Josh's ankle while Ellen talked. "You said you're looking for Thomas Hayes?" she asked, ladling stew into bowls for her own family. "He's a good man. His shop is on Main Street, right next to the Mercantile. Can't miss it. There's a sign out front with his name carved real pretty." "I heard about his mother," Levi said carefully. "About Caroline." Ellen's expression softened with sympathy. "Such a loss. She was special, that woman. Always had a kind word, always helping where she could." Thomas took it hard when she passed. They were close, those two, and his father. Robert was a fine man too. Taught Thomas everything he knew about woodworking. Thomas still uses his father's tools, keeps them sharp and oiled like Robert taught him. Says every time he picks up one of those tools, he feels his father with him. The words struck Levi like a physical blow. His son carried another man's legacy, used another man's tools, called another man father. As it should be, Levi reminded himself. Robert Hayes had earned that title. Levi had forfeited it the day he walked away from Abilene. After the meal, Ellen insisted on packing food for his journey, though Levi tried to explain he was only going into town, and Samuel checked Mercy's hooves, found a stone lodged in one, and removed it with practiced care. Their hospitality was genuine, offered without expectation of return. "You planning to stay in Silver Creek?" Josh asked as Levi prepared to leave. "Don't know yet," Levi admitted. "Depends on how things go." Josh studied him for a moment, his old eyes sharp despite his years. "Whatever business you have with Thomas Hayes, I'll tell you this. He's a good judge of character, fair-minded, doesn't hold grudges, but he doesn't suffer fools either. You go to him honest. He'll treat you honest in return." Levi nodded his thanks and set off toward town, his heart beating harder with each step. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A beautiful evening, the kind that made a man grateful to be alive. But Levi barely noticed it. His entire focus was on the buildings ahead, on the carpentry shop that held his son. Main Street was quiet. Most of the shops closed for the day. A few people moved along the boardwalks, a woman carrying a basket, two men in conversation outside what looked like a saloon, a child chasing a hoop with a stick. Normal life, the kind Levi had observed from a distance for most of his years. He found the carpentry shop easily, just as Ellen had said. The sign hanging above the door was beautifully crafted, the letters carved with obvious skill, Thomas Hayes, fine carpentry and furniture. Through the front window he could see furniture on display, tables, chairs, a rocking horse that must have been for children. Each piece showed craftsmanship and care, but the shop was dark, the door locked. Levi stood outside for a long moment, staring at his son's name carved in wood. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the sign, tracing the letters of a name he'd never known existed until 4 days ago. A voice from behind startled him. "Shop's closed for the day. Opens again at 7 tomorrow." Levi turned to find a man in his 30s standing on the boardwalk, arms crossed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and steady eyes that assessed Levi with open curiosity. He wore working clothes, carpenter's clothes, with sawdust still clinging to his sleeves. This was Thomas, had to be. The resemblance to the photograph was unmistakable, though the man before him was older now, his face carrying the lines that came from years of hard work and responsibility. But those eyes, Caroline's eyes, were the same. "I'm not here to buy anything," Levi said, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm here to—" He stopped. What was he here to do? To disrupt this man's life? To claim a relationship he'd abandoned before it began? To burden him with the truth about who his real father was? Thomas waited, patient but clearly curious. "You all right, mister? You look like you've been traveling rough." "I have," Levi managed. "Came from up north. Ranch got destroyed in a storm." "Sorry to hear that." Thomas's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "You got a place to stay tonight?" "The boarding house up the street has rooms. I'll manage." Levi forced himself to meet his son's eyes. This close, he could see the details. The small scar on Thomas's left cheek, probably from a childhood accident. The strong hands that came from years of working with wood. The wedding ring on his finger, worn and comfortable. "You sure? You look about ready to fall over." Thomas glanced at Mercy, who was standing patiently by a hitching post. "That your donkey? She looks thirsty. There's a trough behind my shop. You can water her there if you like." The kindness in the offer, the casual generosity, reminded Levi so much of Carolyn that his chest tightened. This was her son, raised with her values, her compassion. "Thank you," Levi said. "That's kind of you," Thomas shrugged. "Not kind. Just being neighborly." He started to walk away, then paused and looked back. "You got a name, mister?" This was the moment. Levi could feel it hanging in the air like something breakable. One word would change everything, would set in motion a conversation that couldn't be taken back. "Levi," he said finally. "Levi Boone." Thomas nodded, showing no recognition of the name. Why would he? As far as Thomas knew, his father had been Robert Hayes, a good man who'd raised him right and left him a legacy of skill and integrity. Well, Levi Boone. "Welcome to Silver Creek. Hope you find what you're looking for." Thomas turned and walked up the street, heading toward a small house at the end of the block. Through the windows, Levi could see lamplight and movement, a family gathering for the evening meal. Thomas's family. His grandchildren were in that house, children whose names he knew, but whose faces he'd never seen. Levi stood alone on Main Street as the sun finished setting, as the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped. He'd found his son, had stood face to face with him, had heard his voice, had seen the man Caroline's letters had promised he would become, and he still didn't know what to say. Levi took a room at the boarding house, a small space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over Main Street. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Patterson, charged him 50 cents for the night and threw in breakfast without being asked. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "You look worn down to the bone," she said, showing him to his room. "Bath is down the hall if you want one. I'll have fresh towels sent up." After she left, Levi sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out Caroline's letters again. He'd read them so many times, he practically had them memorized. But touching them, seeing her handwriting, made her feel less distant somehow, less gone. One letter, written in 1860 when Thomas was 13, spoke about the boy's growing interest in carpentry. He'd been spending all his free time in Robert's workshop, learning to read wood grain, to sharpen tools, to measure twice and cut once. Caroline had written with such pride about watching her son discover his calling, about seeing him develop the patience and precision that good craftsmanship required. She'd also written about Thomas asking questions again. He'd wanted to know more about his real father, had pressed her for details she'd been reluctant to give. What had he looked like? What had he been good at? Why had he left? Caroline had answered carefully, trying to be honest without being cruel. She told Thomas that his father had been a good man who'd gotten lost in his own demons, that sometimes people ran from love because they didn't know how to hold it. Reading those words now, Levi felt the full weight of his cowardice. Caroline had protected him even in explaining his abandonment, had given him more grace than he deserved. And Thomas had grown up carrying questions that had no satisfying answers, shaped in part by the absence of a man he'd never known. Sleep came hard that night. Levi lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of Silver Creek settling in for the night. Dogs barking, distant conversation, the clop of horse hooves on packed dirt. Through his window, he could see Thomas's house at the end of the street, lamplight glowing warm in the windows until late, then finally going dark. His son was sleeping in that house. His grandchildren were sleeping in that house. They were so close he could walk there in 5 minutes, knock on the door, speak the truth that had traveled 30 years to reach them. But what right did he have? What good would it do to tell Thomas that the man he'd called father wasn't his real father? Robert Hayes had earned that title through presence, through showing up day after day, through teaching his skills and his values to a boy who'd needed guidance. Levi had contributed nothing but DNA and absence. Maybe the kindest thing would be to leave in the morning. To let Thomas continue his life unburdened by the knowledge of who his biological father was. Some truths caused more harm than healing, but even as he thought it, Levi knew he wouldn't leave. Couldn't leave. He'd come too far, carried these letters too long. And there was something Caroline had written in one of her final letters, something that had stuck with him. She'd written that Thomas had a right to know where he came from, that even if Levi never appeared, even if the letters stayed buried forever, Thomas deserved the truth about his heritage. She'd saved everything, letters, the photograph, the lock of hair, not to punish Levi, but to preserve a record for their son, so that someday, if the chance came, Thomas could know his full story. Morning arrived with pale sunlight and the smell of frying bacon drifting up from the kitchen. Levi washed his face in the basin, put on his cleanest shirt, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Patterson setting out breakfast for her boarders. Just him and a traveling salesman who was too busy with his eggs to make conversation. "You staying in Silver Creek long?" Mrs. Patterson asked, refilling his coffee. "Don't know yet. Depends on some things." She studied him with those sharp eyes. "You got the look of a man carrying something heavy. Not judging, mind you, just observing. I've run this boarding house for 23 years. You learn to read people." Levi considered his response carefully. "I'm looking to have a conversation with someone. Not sure how it'll go. Advice from an old woman who's seen her share of difficult conversations." She didn't wait for permission. "Whatever you need to say it plain. Don't dance around it. People appreciate honesty, even when it hurts." After breakfast, Levi walked Mercy down to the livery stable and arranged for her to be fed and watered. The stable hand, a young man of maybe 18, was gentle with the old donkey, speaking soft words while he brushed her coat. It reminded Levi that there was still kindness in the world, still young people learning how to care for things. He spent the morning walking around Silver Creek, learning its geography, seeing how his son's life was woven into this place. He found the church where Caroline was buried, a modest white building with a well-tended cemetery beside it. Her grave was easy to find, marked by a simple stone, "Caroline Hayes, beloved wife and mother, 1822-1875. Robert's grave was next to hers. Robert Hayes, faithful husband and father, 1820-1871. Levi stood before the graves for a long time, hat in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Sorry I wasn't there. Sorry you had to carry my weight along with your own. You did better with him than I ever could have. Thank you for that." The words felt inadequate, too small for what needed expressing. But they were all he had. From his pocket he pulled out a small wooden cross he'd been carving during his journey, made from a piece of mesquite he'd found on the trail, shaped with his pocket knife during the long evening hours. It wasn't much, wasn't fancy, but he'd put care into it. He'd carved Caroline's initials on one side and on the other a simple message, for the boy who drew pictures of his father. He placed the cross at the base of Caroline's headstone. It seemed right somehow leaving this token here, an acknowledgement that she'd kept their son safe, that she'd preserved a door he'd never expected to walk through. Behind him, a voice said, "That's my mother's grave." Levi turned to find Thomas standing a few yards away, still in his work clothes, sawdust on his boots. His expression was curious rather than hostile, but there was a wariness there too. A man protecting his mother's memory from a stranger. "I know," Levi said. "I knew her. A long time ago." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes moving to the wooden cross Levi had placed. "You made that?" "I did. Not much, but it's good work." Thomas knelt down to examine it more closely. "Clean cuts!" "Steady hand." He looked up at Levi with new interest. "You a carpenter?" "Rancher." "Was a rancher. But I've done enough repair work to know which end of a knife to use." Thomas stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "You knew my mother?" "In Abilene. 30 years ago. Before you were born." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a flicker of understanding that quickly became guarded. "Before I was born," he repeated slowly. He looked at Levi differently now, reassessing. "You're him, aren't you? You're the man she wouldn't talk about." The moment hung between them, fragile and sharp. Levi could deny it, could claim he was just an old friend, could walk away and let the truth stay buried with Caroline. Instead, he met his son's eyes and said, "Yes." Thomas took a step back, his jaw tightening. "After 30 years. You show up after 30 years. "I didn't know," Levi said quickly. "About you. I didn't know she was pregnant when I left. I found letters she wrote buried under my ranch. The storm tore everything up and—" He stopped, realizing how it sounded. Excuses stacked on top of excuses. "You left her pregnant. I didn't know you left her." Thomas's voice was hard now, anger breaking through his initial shock. "Whether you knew about me or not, you left her alone." "I did. And I've regretted it every day since." "Have you?" Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny way of showing regret, staying away for 3 decades. "I was a coward," Levi said simply. "I was young and scared, and I ran from the best thing in my life. There's no excuse for it. I'm not here looking for forgiveness. He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to see you, to know that you were all right, that you'd had a good life despite me not being in it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You want to know if I had a good life? I did, because of my real father, Robert Hayes. He was there. He taught me, guided me, showed up every single day. That's what a father does. Not disappear and show up decades later with a carved cross and regrets." The words hit Levi like fists each one deserved. He stood there taking them, knowing he had no defense to offer. Thomas was right. "About all of it, you're right," Levi said quietly. "Robert Hayes was your father in every way that mattered." "I have no claim on that word. I just wanted you to know you come from somewhere, that your blood father wasn't a monster, just a fool, a coward who ran when he should have stayed." Thomas looked away, his jaw working. When he spoke again, his voice was strained. "Why now? Why come here now?" "Because I lost everything in that storm. And your mother's letters, they were all I had left. Reading them, reading about you growing up, about the man you became." Levi's voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I had to know, had to see for myself, and then I'd planned to leave, to let you keep living your life without this complication. But standing in front of Caroline's grave, I realized she saved those letters for a reason. She could have destroyed them, could have let the past stay buried, but she preserved them, hid them where I might find them. I think—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "I think she wanted you to know the truth. When the time was right." Thomas turned back to him, his expression still hard, but with something else underneath. Curiosity, maybe, or need. "What did the letters say about me?" "Everything. She wrote about your first steps, your first words, the questions you asked about your father, the way you drew pictures of a family you'd never known, how you took to carpentry like you were born for it, how proud she was of the man you were becoming. Levi reached into his coat and pulled out the bundle of letters. "They're yours if you want them. Your mother's words. Her account of your growing up." Thomas stared at the letters, but didn't reach for them. "I don't know if I want to read them. Don't know if I want to know what she thought about you leaving. She was kinder to me than I deserved," Levi said. "But honest, too. She didn't hide what I'd done. She explained it in a way that gave you the truth without poisoning you with bitterness." A woman's voice called from across the cemetery. "Thomas, that you?" A young woman was walking toward them, holding the hand of a small girl with dark curls. The child broke free and ran to Thomas, who scooped her up automatically, his hard expression softening instantly. "Papa! You said you'd take me to see the horses today." "I know, Mary, I will. Just talking to—" Thomas paused, looking at Levi. "Just talking to someone." The woman arrived, slightly out of breath. She was pretty, with kind eyes and a capable manner about her. "Sorry to interrupt. I didn't realize you had company." She extended a hand to Levi. "I'm Martha, Thomas's wife." "Levi Boone," he said, shaking her hand. Up close, he could see his granddaughter clearly. Mary had Caroline's eyes, the same warm brown that saw everything. The resemblance made his chest ache. "Mr. Boone knew my mother," Thomas said carefully. "A long time ago." Martha's expression showed understanding, though she couldn't possibly know the full truth. "I'm sorry for your loss, then. Caroline was a wonderful woman. We all miss her terribly." "Mama, who's that?" Mary asked, pointing at Levi with the unself-conscious directness of a 4-year-old. "That's Mr. Boone, sweetheart. He's a friend of Grandma Caroline's. She's in heaven," Mary said matter-of-factly. "With Grandpa Robert. Papa says they're watching over us." Levi couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to the moment. His granddaughter, so alive and bright and innocent, talking about the grandparents who'd raised her father while he'd been nowhere at all. Thomas set Mary down. "Martha, could you take her home?" "I'll be along shortly." Martha hesitated, clearly sensing the tension, but she nodded. "Of course. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Boone." She took Mary's hand and led her away, the child chattering about horses and asking if she could have cookies before dinner. When they were alone again, Thomas said, "Those are my children. Mary and James, his voice caught. "They're everything to me, everything." "They should be," Levi said. "You're a good father. I can see that from here." "I am. Because Robert Hayes taught me how. He showed me what it meant to put your family first, to show up, to do the hard work day after day. That's the legacy I carry. Not yours," Levi nodded, accepting the truth of it. "I know, and I'm glad of it. Glad you had him." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said something that changed everything. "There's more, isn't there?" "Something you're not telling me," Levi frowned. "What do you mean?" "In my workshop I have a box. My mother gave it to me before she died. Said it was from my father, my real father. She'd been holding on to it for years, waiting for the right time. But she got sick before she could explain what it meant." Thomas's eyes were sharp now, searching. "That's why you're really here, isn't it?" "Because of that box. I don't know anything about a box," Levi said honestly. "Just the letters Caroline buried." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then made a decision. "Come with me. To my workshop. There's something you need to see." They walked back to Main Street in silence, the weight of revelation hanging between them. Thomas unlocked the carpentry shop and led Levi inside. The space smelled of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil. Tools hung neatly on the walls, each one clean and well-maintained. The furniture on display showed skill and artistry, every joint tight, every surface smooth. Thomas went to a back room and returned carrying a wooden box about the size of a small trunk. The wood was dark with age, but beautifully crafted, with dovetail joints and brass hinges. He set it on the workbench. "Mother gave me this 2 weeks before she died. Said my real father had made it, that it was meant for me, but she never explained more than that. I've been afraid to open it, afraid of what I might find, afraid it would somehow betray Robert's memory." Levi stared at the box. "I didn't make this. I've never seen it before. Look at the top." Levi leaned closer. Carved into the lid, worn smooth by time and handling, was a name, Levi Boone, and beneath it, a date, 1846. His breath caught. "I don't understand." Thomas opened the box carefully. Inside was another bundle of letters, but these were different, written in a masculine hand. Levi recognized his own handwriting immediately, though he had no memory of writing them. Thomas pulled out the first letter and began to read aloud. "My dear Caroline, I write this not knowing if I'll ever have the courage to send it. I left Abilene 3 weeks ago, and every mile I put between us feels like a mistake. I was afraid. Afraid of how much I loved you. Afraid of what it would mean to try to build a life with you. My past is dark, Caroline. The things I saw in the war, the things I did, I carry them like stones. And I was terrified that weight would eventually crush anything good between us." Levi reached for the bench to steady himself. "I wrote that." "There are dozens of them," Thomas said. "Letters you wrote but never sent. Letters where you poured out everything you were feeling, all the fear and love and regret. Mother must have found them somehow. Or you sent them after all and she kept them hidden." Thomas picked up another letter, dated months later. "I dream about you every night. Dream about going back, falling to my knees, begging forgiveness. But I don't deserve forgiveness. I left you alone, and that sin can't be undone. The best I can do is stay away, spare you the burden of a broken man, trying to pretend he's whole." The letters went on, documenting months of anguish, of a man wrestling with his conscience. In them, Levi had been brutally honest about his fears, his failures, his desperate longing to return, but his conviction that Caroline deserved better. And in the final letter, dated December 1846, he'd written something that stopped them both. "If I ever have a son, I hope he's nothing like me. I hope he's brave where I'm coward, steadfast where I'm restless, present where I'm absent. I hope he learns from a better man than I'll ever be, how to love without fear, how to stay when staying is hard, how to build something lasting. That's my prayer for a child I'll never know, that he escapes my nature and finds something better." Thomas set the letter down with shaking hands. "You wrote this before I was born, before you even knew I existed." "I don't remember," Levi whispered. "I was drunk most of that year, writing letters I never meant to send, trying to bleed out the guilt. I thought I'd burned them all. You must have sent them to her, maybe in a moment of courage or weakness. And she kept them. All these years she kept them. Proof that you did love her, that you did care, even if you couldn't stay. The truth of it settled over them like sunlight breaking through clouds." Caroline had preserved not just her letters to Levi, but his letters to her. She'd kept a record of his struggle, his pain, his love. Not to excuse his leaving, but to give their son the complete story, both sides of a complicated truth. Thomas looked at Levi with new eyes, still hurt, still angry, but with understanding beginning to edge in. "You really didn't know about me?" "I didn't, but I should have come back anyway. Should have faced my fears instead of running from them." "Yeah," Thomas said. "You should have." They stood in the workshop as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, two men connected by blood and separated by choices made long ago. The letters lay between them, Caroline's and Levi's both, a complete record of love and failure, hope and regret. Finally, Thomas said, "I need time to read all of this, to think about what it means. You should probably go." Levi nodded. He'd expected nothing else. "Thank you for showing me. For not just thank you." He turned to leave, but Thomas's voice stopped him at the door. "Where are you staying?" "The boarding house. For tonight, at least. Tomorrow. Come by tomorrow evening, after I've had time to read these letters. We'll talk more then." It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't acceptance, but it was a door left open, and that was more than Levi had any right to expect. Levi spent that evening in his room at the boarding house, unable to eat, unable to rest. The discovery of his own letters he'd written in the depths of grief and guilt, and then apparently sent in some moment of courage or weakness, had shaken something loose inside him. He'd spent 30 years believing he was simply a coward who'd run. But those letters told a different story. The story of a man who'd loved deeply and feared that love with equal intensity. He pulled out his journal and tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself drawing, something he hadn't done since he was a young man. He sketched Thomas's face from memory, trying to capture the mixture of anger and curiosity he'd seen in his son's eyes. He drew Caroline's grave. He drew the carpentry shop with its sign bearing his son's name. Around midnight, there was a knock on his door. He opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing in the hallway in her robe, holding a tray with tea and bread. "Couldn't sleep myself," she said. "Thought you might be having the same trouble." He let her in, grateful for the company. They sat by the window, drinking tea and watching Silver Creek sleep beneath the stars. "You going to tell me what's eating at you?" she asked after a while. "Or are we just going to sit here pretending everything's normal?" Levi smiled despite himself. "You're a persistent woman, Mrs. Patterson. I prefer observant. Now talk." So he did. He told her about Caroline, about the letters, about Thomas, about 30 years of running finally catching up with him. She listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew Caroline Hayes, not well, but enough to respect her greatly. And I'll tell you something about her. She didn't do anything without purpose. If she kept those letters, both sets, it was because she believed her son needed to see them, needed to understand the full truth. But what good does the truth do?" Levi asked. "It doesn't change what I did. Doesn't give Thomas back the years he spent wondering about his father. No, it doesn't, but it gives him understanding. And sometimes understanding is its own kind of healing." She refilled his tea. "My husband left me 37 years ago. Ran off with a woman half his age. I spent years hating him for it, years feeling like I wasn't enough. Then 20 years later, he showed up on my doorstep, dying, cancer. He wanted to apologize, wanted to explain that it wasn't about me, that he'd been running from his own fears and failures. Did you forgive him?" "I did, not right away. But eventually, yes, because I realized holding on to that anger was just another way of letting him control my life. Forgiveness didn't mean what he did was all right. It meant I was choosing to stop carrying his weight." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Give Thomas time. He's a good man, which means he'll struggle with this. But Caroline raised him right. He'll find his way to whatever truth he needs." After she left, Levi lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow evening. Thomas had asked him to come back tomorrow evening. That meant he had a full day to wait, to wonder, to prepare himself for whatever conversation awaited. Morning came slowly. Levi rose with the sun and walked Mercy around town, needing the motion to settle his nerves. The town was coming alive. Shop owners opening their doors, children walking to school, wagons rolling down Main Street carrying supplies. Normal life continuing all around him, while his own world teetered on the edge of transformation. He found himself at Caroline's grave again, drawn there like a compass to north. Someone had placed fresh flowers on her headstone, wild flowers, probably picked that morning. Thomas, he guessed. A son who still honored his mother months after her death. "I read them," Levi said to the grave, to Caroline's memory. "The letters I wrote, I don't remember writing most of them. Don't remember being brave enough to send them. But I'm glad I did. Glad you kept them. You always did see more clearly than I did." A breeze stirred the flowers, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Spring in Texas, when the hard ground softened and new life pushed through. Levi wondered if Caroline would have liked the symmetry, her son discovering the truth in spring, in a season of renewal. He spent the afternoon helping at the livery stable, needing to work to keep his hands busy. The stable master, a man named Wilson, was grateful for the help and didn't ask too many questions. They mucked stalls, repaired a broken fence rail, reshod a mare who'd thrown a shoe. The physical labor felt good, familiar. This was something Levi understood. Simple work, clearly defined, with visible results. Not like the emotional terrain he was navigating, where every step felt uncertain. Around 4 o'clock, Wilson invited him to stay for dinner. The man's wife had made enough stew for half the county, and she wouldn't hear of sending anyone away hungry. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind shared between men who'd worked hard together. "You seem like you're carrying something heavy," Wilson said finally, sopping up the last of his stew with bread. "If you need to talk—" "I appreciate it," Levi interrupted gently. "But this is something I need to sort out on my own." Wilson nodded, understanding. Fair enough. But if you need work, need a place to stay for a while, I could use another hand around here. Pays not much, but it's steady. The offer surprised Levi. You don't even know me. I know you work hard and you're good with animals. That's enough. Wilson stood to clear the dishes. Think about it. As the sun began its descent, Levi walked slowly toward Thomas's carpentry shop. His heart was pounding, his palms sweating despite the cool evening air. He'd faced down storms, fought in a war, survived decades of isolation. But nothing had prepared him for this, the possibility of connection after so many years of solitude. The shop was closed, but he could see light in the back room. He knocked, and after a moment Thomas opened the door. His son looked tired, eyes red-rimmed from reading, or crying. Maybe both. Come in, Thomas said, his voice rough. The workshop was different from yesterday. The letters, both Caroline's and Levi's, were spread across the main workbench, organized by date. Thomas had been reading them chronologically, Levi realized, watching his own life unfold through his mother's eyes and watching his father's struggle play out in parallel. I read them all, Thomas said without preamble. It took me all night and most of today. I had to close the shop. Couldn't focus on work. Levi waited, giving his son space to speak. My mother, Thomas's voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. My mother loved you. Really loved you. I can see it in every word she wrote. And you, he gestured at Levi's letters. You loved her too. Maybe not well, maybe not bravely, but you did love her. I did, Levi said quietly. More than I knew how to handle. Robert was a good father, Thomas said firmly. The best. But reading these letters, I understand now why my mother sometimes got sad when I asked about my real father. She was carrying both your griefs, yours and hers. I'm sorry she had to carry that weight. Thomas picked up one of Levi's letters, the one dated December 1846. You wrote this prayer for me. Before you knew I existed. You hoped I'd be nothing like you. I did. Well, I'm not. I'm steadfast. I'm present. I know how to stay when staying is hard. Thomas's voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he held the letter. But I'm also like you in ways I never knew. My mother wrote about your hands, how good you were at fixing things, how you could look at something broken and see how to make it whole again. That's what I do. That's who I am. He set the letter down and looked at Levi directly. I've been angry at you my whole life without even knowing it. Angry at a ghost, a story. And now you're here, real and solid and... He paused, struggling for words. And human. Just human. Not a monster. Not a hero. Just a man who made mistakes and ran from them. That's all I am, Levi agreed. I have children, Thomas said. Mary and James. And when I look at them, I understand something about my mother that I never did before. The fierce love. The fear of failing them. The weight of knowing you're responsible for shaping who they become. He met Levi's eyes. Did you feel that? Even once? Even for a moment? Levi thought about the drawing in his pocket, the child's sketch of a father coming home, about Caroline's words describing a 6-year-old crying because he thought his father left because of something he'd done wrong, about the photograph showing a young man with Levi's build and Caroline's eyes. I didn't know I had a son until 4 days ago, Levi said slowly. But from the moment I read your mother's first letter, yes. I felt it, that fierce love, that terror of having failed you. The weight of knowing I shaped your life through my absence. His voice cracked. I have felt nothing but that since the storm destroyed my ranch and mercy dug up those letters. Thomas turned away, his shoulders shaking. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know if I can call you father. That name belongs to Robert Hayes. He earned it. I know. I would never ask. But maybe, Thomas interrupted, turning back, maybe we could figure out what else we can be to each other. I don't know what that looks like. Don't know if it's even possible. But my mother kept these letters for a reason. She wanted me to know you, to understand the full story. Levi felt tears on his face and didn't bother wiping them away. I would like that. To know you. To be whatever you'll let me be. I have conditions, Thomas said. If you're staying in Silver Creek, if we're doing this, you don't get to run again. You don't get to disappear when things get hard or when you get scared. If you're in for good. I'm in, Levi said without hesitation. I have nowhere else to go, nothing else to be. And I'm done running. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right then, we'll see how it goes. Thomas closed the shop early and invited Levi to his home. Martha knows, he said as they walked down Main Street. I told her everything this morning. She has opinions, but she agreed to dinner. Fair warning, though, she's protective of our family. She won't make this easy. I don't expect easy, Levi said. I don't deserve easy. The house was warm and smelled of cooking meat and fresh bread. Martha met them at the door, her expression guarded but not hostile. Mr. Boone, welcome. Thank you for having me, Levi said. I know this isn't. I appreciate the kindness. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Thomas says you're family. That's enough for me to give you a chance. But hurt him or our children and you'll answer to me. Understood. Mary came running from the back room, followed by a toddler, James, who moved with the unsteady gait of a 2-year-old learning confidence. Mary stopped short when she saw Levi, suddenly shy. Mary, James, Thomas said, kneeling down to their level. This is Mr. Boone. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He's family. Your grandfather. Mary's eyes went wide. Like Grandpa Robert. Different than Grandpa Robert. But yes, family. James toddled over to Levi and grabbed his pant leg, using it to steady himself. He looked up with curious eyes, Caroline's eyes again, and said, Up! Levi looked to Thomas, who nodded. Slowly, carefully, Levi bent down and picked up his grandson. The boy was solid and warm, smelling of milk and sunshine. He patted Levi's face with chubby hands, exploring this new person with the fearless curiosity of the very young. Something in Levi's chest cracked open. This child, this perfect small person, carried his blood, carried Caroline's eyes and Thomas's steady nature, and would grow up in a world Levi had nearly missed entirely. Hello, James, he said softly. I'm very pleased to meet you. James grinned and grabbed Levi's nose. Mary approached more cautiously. Are you really our grandfather? I am. Though I'm new to the job, so you'll have to be patient with me. Do you know any stories? Mary, Martha said gently. Let Mr. Boone sit down first. Dinner's ready. They gathered around the table, Thomas and Martha, the children, and Levi. A family meal, something Levi hadn't experienced in more years than he could count. Martha had made roast chicken and vegetables, bread still warm from the oven. Simple food, perfectly made. As they ate, Mary peppered him with questions. Where did he live? Did he have a horse? Had he ever seen a bear? Levi answered each one, grateful for the child's easy acceptance. To her, the complicated history didn't matter. He was grandfather, and that was enough. Thomas watched quietly, and Levi could see him processing everything, his daughter's easy warmth, his son's innocent curiosity, the way Martha relaxed incrementally as the meal progressed. Watching his family absorb this stranger who was not quite a stranger, after dinner, Thomas brought out a leather-bound book, a family Bible, old and well-used. My mother kept this. Recorded all the important dates. Births, deaths, marriages. He opened it to a page near the middle. She never wrote your name here. Said she was waiting until she knew for certain whether you'd want to be included. The page showed Thomas's birth, March 15th, 1847. Father's name was blank. Mother, Caroline Ann Morrison. Morrison was her maiden name, Thomas explained. She didn't take Robert's name until they married in 1849. He pulled out a pen and ink. If you want, if you're staying, I'd like to fill that in to complete the record. Levi's hand shook as he took the pen. In careful letters, still legible despite his age, he wrote, Levi James Boone. James is my middle name, he said quietly. After my father. Thomas smiled, the first real smile Levi had seen from him. Then I named my son well, even without knowing. They sat in the parlor after the children were put to bed, Martha working on mending while the men talked. Levi told them about his ranch, about the storm, about Mercy and the iron box buried beneath his floorboards. Thomas shared stories about growing up in Silver Creek, about learning carpentry from Robert, about meeting Martha at a church social and knowing immediately she was the one. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Not quite. But it was understanding and connection, and the beginning of something that might eventually become family. As the evening grew late, Thomas walked Levi back toward the boarding house. They stopped at the cemetery, standing before Caroline's grave in the moonlight. "She would have wanted this," Thomas said, "for us to find each other, to try." "I hope so," Levi said. "I hope she'd be proud of the man you've become. I know I am." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wilson at the livery mentioned you might be looking for work. My shop could use help. The business is growing, and I need someone reliable. Someone good with their hands." He paused. "Someone I can teach, if you're interested." Levi's throat tightened. "You'd do that? After everything? You're staying, aren't you? You said you were done running." "I am. I meant it. Then I need to know you'll be all right. That you won't end up desperate or alone. This way I can keep an eye on you, make sure you follow through." Thomas's lips quirked. "Besides, you're not getting any younger. Someone needs to make sure you don't work yourself into the ground." It was concern wrapped in practicality, care disguised as logic, and Levi understood that this was how Thomas showed love, through action, through presence, through the steady work of showing up day after day. "I'd be honored," Levi said, his voice rough with emotion, "to work with you, to learn from you." They stood there in comfortable silence, two men connected by blood and separated by decades, finding their way toward something new. Above them, stars scattered across the Texas sky, the same stars that had watched over Caroline all those years ago, that had witnessed every choice and consequence that led to this moment. The next morning, Levi began his new life. He moved his few belongings into a small room behind Thomas's workshop, a space usually used for storage, but with enough room for a bed and a chair. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had since the storm destroyed his ranch. Thomas started him on simple tasks at first, testing his skills, sanding, finishing, assembling pieces Thomas had already cut and shaped. But Levi learned quickly, remembered skills he'd used years ago when building his ranch, and Thomas gradually gave him more responsibility. They worked side by side, father and son, though neither used those words yet. Instead, they talked about wood grain and tool maintenance, about proper technique, and the patience required for good craftsmanship, safe topics that allowed them to learn each other's rhythms without diving too deep too fast. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, Thomas would ask questions about Levi's childhood, about the war, about what his life had been like on the ranch all those years alone, and Levi answered honestly, holding nothing back. If they were doing this, if they were building something real, it had to be built on truth. One afternoon, about a week after Levi had started working in the shop, Mary came by after school. She'd taken to visiting most days, drawn by curiosity about this new grandfather who smelled like sawdust and told stories about donkeys and storms. "Can you teach me to carve?" she asked, watching Levi shape a table leg with careful precision. Levi looked to Thomas, who nodded permission. "All right, but we start small and safe." He found a piece of soft pine and a small knife, showed Mary how to hold it properly, how to cut away from herself, how to let the wood tell her where it wanted to go. She was focused and careful, her small hands steady as she made her first cuts. "You're a natural," Levi said, and meant it. "Mama says I get it from Papa. He's the best carpenter in Silver Creek." "Your Papa is teaching me," Levi said. "So he must be very good indeed." Mary looked up at him with those Caroline eyes. "Are you sad you missed him growing up?" The question, so innocent and direct, hit him square in the chest. "Yes, very sad. But you're here now. That's good, right?" "Yes, Mary, that's very good." She went back to her carving, satisfied with the answer in the way only children can be. For her, the past was less important than the present. What mattered was that he was here now, that he showed up, that he made time for her questions and her curiosity. That evening, Martha invited Levi to dinner again. something that was becoming a regular occurrence. As they ate, she shared news that made Thomas go still with surprise. "I'm pregnant," she said, her hand on her belly. "Just found out for certain today. The baby should come in late winter." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand, his face breaking into a wide smile. "That's wonderful. Are you feeling all right?" "Tired, but fine. Happy." She looked at Levi. "Your timing was good, Mr. Boone. Another grandchild on the way. Another grandchild. Another chance to be present, to show up, to not miss the important moments." Levi felt the weight and gift of it simultaneously. "I'm grateful," he said simply, "for all of it. For the second chance I don't deserve." "Maybe it's not about deserving," Martha said gently. "Maybe it's about choosing. Every day choosing to stay, to try, to be better than you were yesterday." After dinner, Levi sat on the porch with Thomas, while Martha put the children to bed. The evening was cool, stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," Thomas said after a while, "about those letters, about what my mother wanted. What did she want? For us to know each other, but more than that, for me to understand that people are complicated, that we all carry things, make mistakes, struggle to do right. She didn't want me to hate you or to think you were perfect. She wanted me to see you as human." "I am definitely that," Levi said. "So am I. And I've made mistakes too. Not like yours maybe, but real enough. I've been too proud, too quick to judge, too slow to forgive." Thomas turned to look at him. "But I'm working on it, and having you here, it helps. Helps me remember that everyone deserves a chance to change, to try again." "You're a good man, Thomas. Your mother would be proud. I hope so. I'm trying to be." He stood stretched. "Tomorrow I want to teach you dovetail joints. They're tricky, but once you master them, you can build anything. Furniture that lasts generations." Levi understood the metaphor. They were building something that would last, joint by careful joint. A relationship that had started 30 years too late, but wasn't too late to matter. Not if they did the work. Not if they showed up day after day, choosing connection over fear. "I'd like that," Levi said. "I'd like that very much." 6 months passed like water over stones, each day smoothing the rough edges between Levi and his new life. The work at Thomas's shop became routine, comfortable. His hands remembered skills he'd thought lost to time, and Thomas proved to be a patient teacher, correcting mistakes without judgment, praising good work without excess. The room behind the workshop became home. Levi added small touches, a shelf for his journal and Carolyn's letters, a hook for his coat, a photograph of Thomas's family that Martha had given him. It wasn't much, but it was his, a place to belong after decades of not quite belonging anywhere. He'd purchased a plot in the cemetery, right beside Caroline's grave. Not presumptuous, he'd asked Thomas first, but practical. When his time came, he wanted to rest near the woman he'd loved badly but truly, the woman who'd given him a son and preserved a path back to redemption. Martha's pregnancy progressed, her belly growing round as autumn turned to winter. Mary and James had accepted Levi completely now, calling him Grandpa Levi without hesitation. James had started talking more, and his favorite word seemed to be why, which he deployed with devastating frequency. Levi found he enjoyed answering the endless questions, appreciated the child's curiosity about how things worked. On a cold December morning, Martha went into labor. Thomas was beside himself with worry, pacing the workshop while Levi tried to keep him focused on a cabinet they were building for the church. Finally, around noon, Ellen, Josh's daughter, who'd become the town's unofficial midwife, came to fetch them. "You have a daughter," she told Thomas, beaming. "Strong lungs, good color. Martha's tired but fine. She wants to see you." Thomas ran, and Levi followed at a more measured pace, giving his son time alone with his wife and new child. When he finally entered the bedroom, Martha was propped up against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. Thomas sat beside her, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your granddaughter," Martha said, gesturing Levi closer. The baby was impossibly small, her face red and scrunched. But when Levi leaned in, her eyes opened, dark blue, though Thomas said they'd likely change, and she looked directly at him, as if she knew him, as if she'd been waiting. Her name is Caroline, Thomas said softly. After my mother. We're calling her Carrie. Levi's vision blurred with tears. That's a good name. A strong name. Would you like to hold her? Levi hesitated. His hands were rough, calloused from work, not the kind of hands that should hold something so delicate. But Martha nodded encouragement, and Thomas carefully placed the baby in his arms. She was warm and light, making small sounds like a kitten. Levi looked down at this new life, this child who would grow up knowing her grandfather, who would never have to wonder where she came from or why someone had left. The weight of that gift, being present, being known, settled into his bones like warmth. "Hello, Carrie," he whispered. "I'm your grandfather, and I'm going to be here. I promise you that. I'm going to be here." Christmas came, and Levi spent it with Thomas's family, his family now. They exchanged small gifts, sang carols, told stories by the fire. Mary performed a poem she'd learned at school, and James fell asleep in Levi's lap, his small body heavy with trust. That evening, after the children were in bed and baby Carrie was sleeping in her cradle, Thomas gave Levi a package wrapped in brown paper. "Made this for you," he said. Inside was a wooden box, smaller than the one Caroline had kept, but made with the same care and precision. The lid was carved with intricate detail, a ranch house, a donkey, a man standing at the threshold. It took Levi a moment to realize it was his story, his journey, captured in wood. "I thought you might want a proper place for Mother's letters," Thomas said. "And yours. A way to keep them safe." Levi ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the smooth wood, the careful attention to every detail. "This is beautiful." "Thank you. There's more." Thomas opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a pocket watch. It was Robert's. His father gave it to him, and he gave it to me when I turned 18. "But I want you to have it. Thomas, I can't." "You can. You should." Thomas's voice was firm but gentle. "Robert was my father. He'll always be my father. But you're my father too, in a different way. And I want you to have something that matters. Something that says you're part of this family's history now. Part of our legacy." Levi took the watch with shaking hands. It was gold, well worn, with initials engraved on the back. R.H. "I'll treasure it." "I swear to you, I know you will." Thomas smiled. "That's why I'm giving it to you. Later." Walking back to the shop under a sky full of winter stars, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Peace, not the absence of regret. He would always carry that, but the presence of something stronger, purpose, connection, family. Mercy was waiting in her stall, and he stopped to give her a carrot he'd saved from dinner. The old donkey munched contentedly, her grey coat thick for winter. "We did all right, didn't we, girl?" he said, scratching behind her ears. "It took the long way around, but we got here." In his small room, Levi placed Caroline's letters and his own in the new box Thomas had made. He set the pocket watch beside it, where he could see it every morning when he woke. Reminders of where he'd been, who he'd lost, and miraculously, what he'd found. He pulled out his journal and wrote, "December 25th, 1876. Spent Christmas with Thomas and his family. My family held my newest granddaughter, Caroline, called Carrie. She's perfect. They're all perfect. I don't deserve this second chance, but I'm grateful for it every day. Tomorrow I'll wake up and go to the shop and work beside my son. And the day after that, I'll do it again. That's all any of us can do. Show up, do the work, try to be better than we were yesterday." He closed the journal and lay down in his bed. Through the window, he could see Thomas's house, lights still glowing warm against the darkness. His son was there, his grandchildren were there, and tomorrow he would be there too. For the first time in 30 years, Levi Boone went to sleep without regret. Not because the past had changed, but because the future finally held more than just survival. It held belonging, it held purpose, it held home, and sometimes that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.